Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this online seminar about empirical research at the UN Human Rights Institution. My name is Lieselotte Vianen. I'm professor at the Department of Social Science of the University Carlos III here in Madrid. And I'm also a principal investigator of the ERC project Rivers. And this is another Rivers seminar that we are organizing. I would like to welcome all the people that are joining us online via Zoom. And I understand that we're also broadcasting via YouTube and Facebook. And sorry for a bit the delay of starting this seminar. So this seminar about how to conduct empirical research within the UN is another seminar that we are organizing as Rivers team. We had already a couple of seminars about empirical dialogues in the about human rights organized in 2019 and 2020. If you're interested in these seminars, you can go to our website, to our YouTube channel. We had, for example, Professor Siri Glopen among us of the Center on Law and Social Transformation of the University of Bergen, giving a seminar very interesting about interdisciplinary research methods in human rights. But this seminar, we're focusing on one of the research contexts of this ERC project, which is the United Nations. It's the second research stream. If you're interested in what we are doing, again, you're very welcome to look to our website. And this research stream 2, which is focused at the UN, is focused or is concerned about how to come, how to go towards counter-hegemonic water knowledge and norm production. So this is the first seminar, and probably we will organize more over the course of this project, which runs until 2024. And this specific wants to look at the epistemological and methodological challenges of conducting qualitative and ethnographic research within different kinds of human rights institutions within the United Nations. So I'm extremely happy and extremely grateful that we have Julie Billaud and Miia Halme-Tuomisaari among us. At the poster, we also announced the participation of Maria Sapignoli, but unfortunately, she had to cancel her participation in this seminar. So just a few words about the format of this online seminar. So the first person who will share a bit about her experience of doing empirical and ethnographic work at the UN will be Julie Billaud. After that, Miia Halme-Tuomisaari will share her experiences. Every panelist has like between 20-25 minutes for their presentation. After these two presentations, the PhD researchers from the Rivers Project, Camille Paruel and Marina Vieira, will give some comments on these presentations and linking it towards the Rivers Project, and also ask some questions to Julie and Miia. So then Julie and Miia will reply. But in the meantime, I welcome everyone who is joining us through Zoom, through Facebook, or through YouTube. If you have any concern or any question to ask to both presenters, to write them down and share with us. There are two other team members of the Rivers Project, Elisa and Digna, who are behind the screen supporting us. And they are collecting all the questions that we received through the different channels. And at the end of the seminar, if there are questions, I will address them to the two presenters, and that will be the moment then to have also a broader discussion. So this is a bit more or less the format of this seminar. Once again, to everyone who joined us a bit later, you are very welcome. So I will introduce briefly to Julie Billaud. Julie is a political and legal anthropologist whose research interests lie at the intersection of gender, culture, human rights, humanitarian action, and international governance. She has conducted extremely interesting ethnographic research in Afghanistan, a very complex country, at the United Kingdom, but also at the United Nations Human Rights Council, and more recently at the International Committee of the Red Cross. And she is also author of the book Kabul Carnival, Gender Politics in Post-War Afghanistan. Julie, I'm really happy that you were so positive and so interested to join us in the seminar. So I give you the floor. And as I said, you have like 20-25 minutes for your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Liselotte. It's a great honor to be here with you today and to be able to talk about my work at the United Nations Human Rights Council. I prepared a PowerPoint, so I'm going to share the screen with you if you don't mind. Here it is. Okay, and it's not the right slide, of course. So it didn't start from the beginning, so I guess I have to. Is it working? Yes, I think like it. Okay, so in this presentation, I will discuss the methodological and epistemological challenges of researching the United Nations Universal Periodic Review anthropologically. My remarks are based on a 12-month ethnographic fieldwork carried out in 2010-2011 in collaboration with Jane Cowan, mostly in Geneva, in addition to additional interviews and observations realized on various occasions since then. So these are a few pictures of Palais des Nations and the famous Room 20, where the UPR takes place. But before I describe our research, I think I need to explain to you what the Universal Periodic Review is about. So I'm going to be quite fast because it's a bit descriptive and annoying, and yet I still have, I think, to do this for you to be able to follow what we've done there. So what is the Universal Periodic Review? In fact, it's a mechanism that was established in 2006 as part of the reform of the Human Rights Commission, as a means to respond to critiques according to which the Commission had become politicized and that it tended to name and shame certain states while leaving others unscrutinized. So really the mechanism was established to try and respond to these critiques. So it's a human rights monitoring mechanism within the United Nations human rights system. It is a peer review by the community of states of the human rights record of each of the 193 UN member states. It's intended to complement the other UN mechanism of human rights protection, such as the treaty bodies, the special procedures, the complaint procedures. But it's really distinctive in a number of ways. Indeed, the UPR has been conceived as a universal mechanism. So all states and all human rights are reviewed. It is also conceived as a cooperative mechanism whereby states are encouraged to share best practices and to learn from their peers. And finally, the UPR is based, it's cyclical. So it's based on a 4.5-year cycle composed of 4 main stages. So here is the diagram that describes these 4 stages. The first one is really the preparation of the review. It is the moment during which documentation is prepared, because indeed the review is based on 3 main reports. A national report, which is prepared by the state under review, a compilation written by the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights that acts as a secretariat of the Universal Periodic Review, and which is really composed of extracts from reports of UN agencies, treaty bodies, special procedures. And the final document is a stakeholder summary, also written by the UPR Secretariat, therefore the OHCHR, which is a report based on, which is a kind of a collection of extracts of submissions from civil society organizations, so mostly NGOs, but also national human rights institutions. So that's the first stage. The second stage is the most important or visible moment, I'd say, of the UPR. It's a 3.5-hour interactive dialogue with the UPR working group, taking place in the famous room 20 I showed you in my previous slide, in Palais des Nations in Geneva. It is the moment when the state under review presents its national report and recommending states ask questions, make comments, and offer recommendations that the state under review is free to accept or simply note. So that's the second moment. The third stage of the UPR is the adoption of the report. So a draft report presenting all accepted or not noted recommendation is adopted by the working group 48 hours after the review, before it is officially adopted by the Human Rights Council a few months later. And it's really once this adoption, this official adoption takes place, that the next phase is launched, which is the fourth stage, which is the implementation of recommendations. So it is a stage that lasts from that moment of adoption until the next review, right? And during that stage, NGOs and national human rights institutions participate in consultations with national governments. And they also monitor the implementation of accepted recommendations, while the state implements the recommendations and prepare for its next review. So UPR is really organized on the principle that all states will be reviewed according to rigorously equal and comparable parameters. So what did we want to know when we started this research? Well, actually, I should say that it was a research that was initially conceived by Jane Cohen, and which was funded by the British Academy. And I was employed, in this research as a research collaborator and partner. And really the way we conceived it from the start is that what was to move away from this position that some researchers or most researchers at the UPR start from, which is really a position from within the governance matrix. In other words, as participants or analysts of the UPR, or sometimes both, such researchers are inside the technocratic logic of the international law system, and they really embrace its problem-solving orientations. So what drives these researches in general is the desire to find out how the existing systems work in order to make it work better. Yeah, so it's a kind of evaluation. And by contrast, as anthropologists, we stepped outside of this governance matrix to ask a different set of questions. We did not ask how well does the UPR work, but rather we ask how does the UPR function as a regulatory mechanism? What does the UPR process? So this untidy assemblage of people, of objects, text, utterances that extend across time and space. What does this process consist of concretely? And finally, and perhaps more fundamentally, we ask, how does power operate within the friendly language of best practices and cooperation? Yeah. So we attempted to grasp the UPR holistically, using the diverse toolkits of ethnographic research methods, so participant observations, interviews, reading and analyzing documents, and following how they were produced at the Secretariat via an internship, and at the national level via pre-review field visits. So it was a very difficult research to carry out, anthropologically, because in fact, doing ethnographic research on the UPR and at the UN more generally raises a number of questions. How does one conduct participant observation when the field is so dispersed across time and space? How does one investigate the different moments in the UPR process and the distinctive ways that the UPR is seen and experienced by the various participants depending on their role? How does one understand the identities and the motivations of UPR participants? That is to say, the diplomats, the NGO staff, the activists, the UN civil servants, the interns. How do we understand those individuals when they are leading such transient lives, when they are moving, from one job to the next, from one organization to the next, often literally moving across the boundaries that are supposed to exist between the state, the international, or the civil society? It was very confusing because sometimes we first met one person who worked as a civil servant, at the UN, and then a few months later, we found that same person working for Amnesty International, right? So that was quite complicated to, follow how they spoke and how they changed also their opinions, their vision of the UPR according to their various positions. And finally, how does one access spaces where the public is not allowed or where publicness becomes an issue? So we were only 2 researchers for this project, involved in this project. And obviously a bigger team could have been mobilized to gain a more holistic view of the UPR. So with the means, the financial means that we had, and also the time we had at our disposal, we had to develop creative strategies to be able to grasp the many facets of the mechanism. So after observing a series of public reviews in room 20 of Palais des Nations, we realized that these public events, even though they were quite interesting, and fascinating in many ways, they were also quite boring and repetitive, right? I mean, some of you who've carried out research at the UN, who have worked for the UN, you know very well how repetitive these meetings are. So we observed a number of reviews. You see a picture of me here. We looked at the documents we could collect, which were lying on the tables in room 20. We talked to the people we found. We came across, who intervened in the UPR. We talked also to the UN translators, anyone we could find. And very quickly, we realized that these public events were only really the tip of the iceberg of a larger process, which involved a myriad of actors and administrative procedures, which were scattered across time and space, as I said earlier. So we discovered that the so-called interactive dialogue, which is actually not very interactive, because all the statements are written in advance, because all statements are so much time, there's no room for improvisation of any kind. So this moment called the interactive dialogue was perhaps not the most interesting moment of the UPR. So we decided to observe the backstage. As we progressed in our fieldwork, we became more conscious that most negotiations actually were taking place off stage. In the Serpentine Bar, and I show you a picture of this place there, the Serpentine Bar, where diplomats discussed the recommendation they intended to give to each other. In the side events organized in parallel to each reviews, where NGOs lobbied states to take their recommendations on board. In the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, where drafters devised narrative strategies to make the documents speak. In the processions, which were organized by the Geneva-based NGO UPR Info, which is in fact an NGO that was born at the same time as a mechanism which acts as a kind of gatekeeper of the UPR. And it's a very interesting NGO because it has been extremely, creative in shaping the UPR actually. And they've created these pre-sessions which mirror in their format a little bit the interactive dialogue, except that instead of having a state delegation speaking to the working group, you've got a panel of NGOs representatives that speak to diplomats and that try to sensitize them to their issues. So we observed some of these pre-sessions as they started to be established in 2011. And we realized that beyond the many bureaucratic procedures on which the mechanism relies to achieve its objective, the UPR was also significantly shaped by social relations that most researches on UN bureaucracies tend to overlook or consider as irrelevant. Indeed, especially during the first cycle when our research was conducted, the mechanism was not totally consolidated yet in terms of modalities, leaving some room for open for improvisation and creativity. And because the UPR was still in the making, we were curious to discover how the various actors involved in it used the cracks in the system to promote their own agendas, their own visions of human rights. Yeah. So we therefore attended numerous side events as well as occasional meetings, trainings, receptions, and parties. We attended a course at the Geneva Academy that was designed for actually NGOs and diplomats to learn about the UN system and how to be effective within the UN system. So we learned all that as good students of the mechanism. We also attended classes. But most importantly, however, was the fieldwork we conducted in these informal spaces that I mentioned earlier in Palais des Nations, where participants gathered before, after, or in between reviews. So the Serpentine Bar was a major meeting point for diplomats to exchange information, for NGOs to lobby state representatives, and for international civil servants to exchange information. And as we became more familiar with the space, we were sometimes able to join these conversations around a cup of coffee and discuss the UPR more informally. And it was often easier to approach diplomats directly in the bar than through more formal channels such as emails or phone calls, which often were left unresponded to. These ad hoc discussions allowed us to get a glimpse of the person also behind the position and to gain a deeper understanding of the motives guiding formal statements made public during a state review. So we would interview diplomats and ask them, okay, how did you come up with such a statement? What was the procedure? Who was consulted? Which voice mattered much? I mean, all these layers of understanding could not be gained by simply observing the public reviews. So this is really how we became acquainted with the intricate rules of diplomatic etiquette and mode of sociality in a space that was not really, that was so transient, as I said, and where faces and position changed constantly. The Palais des Nations ground floor cafeteria was also an important space, a space conducive to informal exchanges with diplomats, secretariat staff, Geneva-based NGO staff, in-country NGOs representatives visiting for a few days or weeks, or the interns attached to any of these kinds of organization. So sharing a lunch with them was often the most appropriate way to follow our informants' own work pace. Some of whom really had very little time, so that was the only moment we could actually catch them. We also spent some time in Salon des Délégués when we were invited, sometimes by diplomats to talk. And like many academics studying the work of international organization, the people we met led very transnational lives. We therefore struggled to build long-term, meaningful relationship, as would be the case in a more classic fieldwork. So often we had to rely on one-off conversations between two planes or between two meetings. Another important actor we realized was the UPR Secretariat, or in other words, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, because indeed, in spite of its rather low profile, the OHCHR Secretariat plays a significant role in the UPR process. It's part of the backstage, the invisible kind of, things that takes place, which are nevertheless significant if we want to understand what the UPR is about. So indeed, the Secretariat staff played a significant part in the production, as well as in the social life of the documents they produced for the UPR. So after an interview I carried out with a UPR drafter working in the Field Operation and Technical Cooperation Department of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, it became very clear to me that I would not be able to gain any deep understanding of the documentation process without participating in this work and observing it firsthand. I therefore applied for an internship, and a few months later, I became part of the team of UN drafters in charge of preparing the documents for the last session of the first cycle of the UPR. I was particularly interested in understanding how information was selected, reformulated, organized in the final UPR documents. For instance, I wanted to know in details how the stakeholders quoted in the stakeholders summary, which is one of the 3 documents I talked about in the introduction of my presentation, how the stakeholders were selected. I wanted to understand which of their issues were represented and what kinds of concerns inform such decisions. And then finally, both Jane and I, we carried out fieldwork in 2 national contexts. Although our research was mostly Geneva-based, we realized from the start that it would be essential to try to get a sense, even if a modest one, of how UPR was perceived and being engaged with in the national context. So we therefore carried out pre-session fieldworks in Belgium and in Greece so as to explore how these 2 countries prepared for their upcoming reviews. So Jane had spent many years living and researching in Greece since 1975, and she speaks Greek fluently. Greece interested us as a country positioned at the margins of Europe that was facing intense popular unrest since the financial crisis. So it was also an interesting country from that perspective of being on the margins of Europe and yet having or facing many human rights issues. And Belgium, by contrast, represented the administrative heart of the European Union that intriguingly, despite its apparent tranquility at the time, had been unable to form a government since June 2010. So these 2 countries presented significant, interesting human rights issue, equally important. They were known to us and affordable to visit within our research budget. So that's how we came to select them. We hope that by soliciting accounts of the preparation in country of 2 reviews, we would get a glimpse of the national process leading to a more rounded picture and greater insight into the mechanism. Beside the civil servants in charge of organizing consultations with civil society and preparing the national report, we also discussed with employees of national human rights institutions and with NGOs. These fieldworks also enabled us to evaluate the scope of constraints and opportunities that the UPR had opened up for discussions about human rights at the national level. Finally, so that's, of course, the 2 main offices of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Palais Wilson, and the office at Numota. And the last thing that I want to talk about is about the importance of objects. That was also a very important focus of attention, because we conceived the UPR from the start as an assemblage, right? As an assemblage composed of people object text utterances. And that made us sensitive to the mundane materiality of the UPR, something that is often remains unnoticed, but that has, a very important significance, I think. So we observed how speakers lists, fact sheets, simultaneous translations, cell phones, emails, clocks, databases, webcasts, how these different objects mediated the contents of claims made during the UPR process. We were here a little bit inspired by actor network theory. We wanted to know how things act to invite, shape, channel, and block human efforts to intervene in the UPR. How human and non-human actants, to use Bruno Latour's terminology, how these human and non-human actants operate together in various relational assemblages or networks. And such an attention, we believe, could help understand this mechanism anew as relational and productive instead of fixed and unchanging. This approach was really instrumental to opening the black box of documents production at the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. For example, during my internship, I discovered that NGOs sending their contributions to the Secretariat could not verify whether their text had reached the responsible person. So the Human Rights Council branch in Palais Wilson was in charge of receiving and collecting the contributions of NGOs. Two secretaries kept a manual registry in which the email addresses of the NGOs, as well as their name and the nature of their contribution, whether these contributions were single or joint contributions, all this information was recorded manually. I think it has changed since then, but that was the way it was done at the beginning of the process. The contributions of the NGOs and the registry were then placed in a computer hard drive, which could be accessed by all drafters located in the MOTA building. But because all this work was done manually, contribution could be lost. And in the case of Belgium, where I'd been before, my internship, a contribution from 3 NGOs, in fact, never reached the FOTCD office, in spite of the fact that these NGOs were provided with a certificate of reception. I realized that because I had met this NGO, I had collected their contribution when I had done my visit in Belgium. So this made me realize that actually NGOs' participation was both enabled and also hampered by technologies. And that was an interesting discovery, right? So to conclude, perhaps I talk a little bit about, very quickly, because I think I'm taking too much time, right? Tell me when I have to stop, please, Lot, right?
No, that's fine. That's fine.
That's fine.
I'd love to hear some of your conclusions.
Right. So I'm reaching my conclusion. So what this method, and maybe here I stop sharing because it's no longer really important. Yeah. So what this method helped us realize was that basically the principles on which the UPR is based, which are the principle of universality, equality, all these principles that are central to the mechanism are in fact interpreted in or implemented in quantitative terms, right? So during the reviews, for instance, all recommending states are given the same amount of time to intervene in the interactive dialogue. And these interventions are strictly timed, and their microphones are cut if they exceed the time they have given to speak. So that's one aspect of quantitative equality. We can find this same approach to equality in the way documents are put together. So all documents, present a strict word limit. They have to follow the same disposition of paragraphs and are written according to similar linguistic patterns. So, X states recommends that, or Y states recommend that, and Z states is concerned that, and so on and so forth. And since synthesizing the material is not permitted, the summary of stakeholders, which is built on the same format, is made up of a collection of direct quotes, which are extracted from NGOs' contributions. And put together, these documents resemble really an assortment of sound bites without any unifying melody. Yeah. And these bureaucratic and administrative formats do not leave any room, therefore, for a more qualitative approach to equality, whereby developing or least developed states can explain the structural and economic constraints they face. And this often leads to them to be seen as the bad students of the UPR, because they have to kind of contour the rules to be able to speak. Another important finding is that transparency creates new forms of opacity. Transparency is mostly achieved through bureaucratic procedures which reveal as much as they conceal. So, for example, reviews are meant to be public, yet the public cannot access the public gallery of room 20 without obtaining the required accreditations. It's not a very complicated procedure, but you need to have the know-how to find where it is on the site to be able to actually get these accreditations. Actually, when I teach, on the UPR in my classroom, I let students, find a way to get access to the public gallery so that they realize by themselves how transparent, the UPR is actually and public. Individuals, including researchers who wish to observe the reviews from the ground floor on room 20, need to be sponsored by an NGO with an ECOSOC status. And this took us a little bit of time to realize that this was a way to access the ground floor. But really, when we managed to get, an NGO to sponsor us, it really changed what we could observe. It also changed our access to, the different UPR stakeholders. But that's something also that you need to know in order to be able to do. That's something that, that is not given. Reviews webcasts together with all UPR documents, including NGO submissions, are available for consultation on the OTHR website. And yet the site's architecture resembles a maze and is really difficult to navigate, to the extent that OTHR staff themselves use the UPRinfo.org website to access the documents they need. So you see, it's another also layer of opacity. Yeah. Documents which are produced by the OTHR Secretariat are public documents that anyone can access, and yet their specialized jargon and the absence of historical contextualization make them very difficult to read. The documents do not give any do not provide any room for an explanation of the political and economic context or the history of the state under review, so that report dealing with different countries often look strikingly similar. So in short, in spite of its claim to transparency, publicness remains relative at the UPR. One needs the necessary cultural capital and know-how to be able to read documents, observe the reviews, and participate in them. So really, these findings highlight what Marilyn Strathern calls the tyranny of transparency, which is inherent in the UPR. Indeed, making society visible, as Marilyn Strathern argues, and producing more information goes hand in hand with creating certain technologies of visibility and certain disciplinary regimes. So if on the one hand, the relative publicness of the exercise has popularized human rights at the global level, it has also forced states to constantly monitor themselves by putting in place internal procedures of action and measurements, action plans, targets, indicators, sometimes with unintended or even insidious side effects. States are gradually disciplined to internalize certain norms and standards, which eventually define what counts and what doesn't count as a human right. And in this sense, UPR is a manifestation of audit culture. Yeah, it's a potential weapon against hard criticisms, and it's also subtly coercive in drawing actors into the project of self-management. So I think this is what anthropological research at the UPR on human rights mechanism can do. It can offer this possibility of discerning and then trying to unpack the array of micro-practices that participate in the making of such a complex mode of governance. By observing the people, the relationships, the power struggles, the technologies, the objects behind the documents, behind the webcast, behind the reports, we can reveal, at least partially, the inner working of the system. And in that sense, the ultimate aim of such research is not to evaluate whether human rights monitoring works to improve the world, but it's to explain how it works and what it does, what are the effects. And I believe that analyzed from such a standpoint, the main outcome of the Universal Periodic Review is not the simple list of recommendations made by some states to another, which are these recommendations which seem to be the most important moment of the mechanism because they are recorded on the paper. Rather, I would argue, and actually we would argue, the outcome is the process itself, including what it indirectly sets in motion and the new phenomenon of self-discipline that it generates. So I'm going to end here. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Julie, for this brilliant and very rich description of the research that you did at Geneva, at the UPR, and unpacking all those different layers of that inner working of that system. Actually, it really reminded me, in my time, I worked for a couple of years at the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights, but in Ecuador. I was there responsible for indigenous peoples and Afro-descendants, but in those years, Ecuador had to prepare their UPR for the second time. And although I was not really directly involved, but my colleague was involved, and she had to gather all the information of the different of the different agencies towards the previous UPR recommendations. And that document took a long time, and we called it a Frankenstein document, because despite the fact that the UN, well, normally human rights based approach should be mainstreamed through all the UN agencies, from UNICEF to us, to the UNDP and so on, we realized that it's not the case. And many of the people who had to send in their input for that consolidated assemblage document to send it to Geneva didn't really understand what it was about, what language that they had to use, because they never reflected through a human rights lens to their work. So now thinking about what you just all explained, it's indeed fascinating. And yeah, once an anthropologist, always an anthropologist, even though you work within the system. And yeah, I found it really fascinating. So what you just presented, thank you so much.
Thanks. I like the Frankenstein document, so I'll probably quote you if you don't mind later on.
That's fine. Yeah. So I now give the floor to Miia, and I keep inviting the participants to the seminar to send in their questions or their reflections about what Julie just shared with us, or Miia. As there will be another round, the last round will be giving some questions out of the public, so you can or write them down in the chat of Zoom, or if people joining us through Facebook or YouTube, also there are spaces to place your questions or concerns or reflections about this really fascinating work of doing research within that monster of the United Nations. So Miia, Miia Halme-Tuomisaari is a legal anthropologist specialized in the analysis of the contemporary human rights phenomenon. She has done fieldwork at the UN Human Rights Committee, monitoring state compliance with the ICCPR, as well as archival research on the origins of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Her recent publication includes Movement in the Right Direction, New Paradoxes in the Human Rights, which is part of the Sage Handbook of Cultural Anthropology. And Miia is currently Associate Professor of Human Rights Study at Lund University. Welcome, Miia, and I give you the floor for your presentation.
Thank you very much, Lieselot. It's a great pleasure to be here joining this webinar. Rivers is a fascinating project, and I'm very pleased to be a part of this discussion. Thank you also to Julie for a wonderful presentation, which actually does create a nice background for my own research as well, since I'm talking of something that is very closely related to the UPR. Also very nice to see so many people, even though not physically, of course, but seeing the number of people here attending this webinar. Maybe one day we'll all have a chance to meet up in person again. Here's to hoping. I'll start also sharing my screen, and let's see here. Just 1 second, I need to go. There we go. So my presentation is titled What UN? Methodologically Blonde Reflections on Doing Ethnography at the UN. And in this talk, very bluntly, to summarize in 3 points, I wish to discuss what access, then what UN, and finally what insights. A nice triad here to keep things nice and organized. And my presentation is based on the work that I have been doing following the documentary cycles of the UN Human Rights Committee. Now, this is a treaty body that monitors how states comply with the obligations that they have taken by becoming parties to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And for me, I've actually really been fascinated by the treaty body framework and the Human Rights Committee in particular for a long time. And my interest goes back to the 1940s, when there was a movement to lobby for the creation of a binding international Bill of Rights, which would have a World Court of Human Rights to back it up. Now, this project, as maybe some of you know, never really took off the ground. There was never even close to sufficient state support for it. Rather, as is also widely known, states, the leading powers of the time, were dead set against anything even whiffing of binding commitments in regards to human rights. And therefore, the project of establishing a World Court of Human Rights never properly took off the ground. It has not been buried, or it has not disappeared. Rather, quite interestingly, this idea is still alive, and it seems to surface regularly, most recent instance being circa 2010 and 12, when there was actually a proposal even with a full description of what the court would entail. Nevertheless, in its absence, it has been said that the Human Rights Committee is the closest equivalent that the UN has to a human rights court. It has been called, or is commonly called, as the most legal of all of the UN human rights monitoring mechanisms, and within the cluster of 10 UN treaty bodies which monitor state compliance with the main human rights treaties, it is often called as the most authoritative and influential of them all. My talk, what I'm sharing today, is loosely based, parts of it, on an article that came out in 2018 in Social Anthropology, Methodologically Blonde at the UN in a Tactical Quest for Inclusion. And I also wanted to mention, to give myself a bit more additional pressure to really finalize the blasted thing, that I am also in the process of getting all of this stuff whipped into a nice book, or at least a book. You know, I'll settle for either at this stage. Then, just very quickly, apologies, my own face on my screen is blocking. There we go. the title here, I wanted to just very quickly share an overview of the UN human rights framework and the UN as an organizational cluster in its whole. So we see here that there's the International Criminal Court, which actually is the court in existence under the UN. We could discuss a long time why it's not a human rights court per se. Of course, in other ways it is. Nevertheless, for the description that I offered, it does not quite qualify. It's something slightly different, primarily because its level or area of jurisdiction is clearly defined around a particular number of crimes. Then there's also the International Court of Justice, which is also not a human rights court per se, even though some people argue that it might one day become the International Court of Justice and Human Rights. And then we see the structure with Security Council, General Assembly, UN Secretariat, and then ECOSOC, Economic and Social Council. And under General Assembly, right next to the UN Secretariat, we see the treaty bodies, including the Human Rights Committee, which actually really curiously is not on the list, which is a nice way of questioning whether it really is the most important of all of them. Of course, one graph won't share that, but actually interesting that it is not there. One of the interesting things to notice is that the branch between the treaty bodies and the Secretariat is not as tight as one might imagine. As Julie also described, the UN Secretariat, the Office of the High Commissioner, is really, really important in the operations of, well, everything that the UN does. Nevertheless, what's important to recognize is that treaty bodies are definitely not part of the Secretariat. And also, treaty bodies have been established on the basis of covenant provisions for the covenant they monitor. So for CAT, Covenant Against Torture, it would be CAT that would stipulate the existence of the committee and so forth and so forth. This gives the treaty bodies a curious nature. They, on the one hand, are bodies of the UN, and on the other hand, they're not. They're not in the sense that they are independent in their operations. So members to treaty bodies, of which the Human Rights Committee has 18, they are proposed for nominations by states. Nevertheless, when they are elected, they are absolutely not supposed to represent states, but rather they're supposed to represent human rights interests and their own realm of expertise. They're also absolutely not employees of the Office of the High Commissioner. They're not members of the UN Civil Service. So they are members of a UN high-profile expert body, but they are not UN employees. Now, this is just one interesting observation to recognize that when we talk of the UN, something, well, here we don't really need ethnographic research yet, but something that we discover quite quickly is that it may be quite difficult to define exactly what the UN really is and where the border of what it is not really resides. Julie showed images of documentary cycles with the UPR. Indeed, here the treaty bodies are quite similar. I think documentary cycles are a big part of what the UN does. It is largely about changing, working with documents and changing their location. And here is a description of what happens with the treaty body cycle. The treaty body also has a number of different forms of operations. One of them, which is public and in certain ways, amounts for the bulk of work, is the processing of state reports. And this, very much like the UPR process, is a cyclical process where states they submit reports where they share how they have complied with the obligations that they have taken on by becoming parties to the ICCPR. The idea is that the reports that come in show a definite progress that has taken place. So ideally, when a state submits its first report or second report, there should be advancement of some kind, improvement by the fourth or the fifth. And here you can also see that there are a number of opportunities for NGOs to make interventions. However, what is important is that the constructive dialogue, it was called the interactive dialogue with the UPR. Here it is called the constructive dialogue. That only takes place between members of the committee and states. NGOs have an opportunity to join in on closed lunchtime sessions where they can address members of the committee directly, but they're not able to join in on the constructive dialogue. Also, importantly, differing from the UPR, there's no room for negotiation or bargaining even on the recommendations that are given by the treaty body. Rather, this is something that has to do with an expert evaluation. And this summarizes the interesting relationship that we still see with treaty bodies, and also why I'm fascinated by them, and why I think they are very logically anthropological targets of investigation. We see that their relationship with the law is really, really interesting. This element of having an expert evaluation would somehow echo the idea of a court delivering a judgment. Of course, treaty bodies cannot do that. They have no authority to issue binding decisions. Rather, they are able to issue concluding observations and documents called general comments. Now, this is again why this is so clearly anthropological in my view. This is an incomplete legal system, if you want, where I find that this is actually, there's a lot more to study, how the process of legalizing human rights, how advancing the role of the law in states around the world, how that is happening, via what kind of navigation, negotiation, and what kind of techniques. Here's an example of a document that has to do with my own research, which here I will move on to next in the question, what access? Now, let me take you here very quickly to the Palais Wilson in Geneva. We already saw an image, a smaller one here with Julie's presentation. For my talk, the Palais Wilson is absolutely at the center of everything, because this is where treaty body proceedings take place in Geneva. And I have a couple of images here from inside the Palais. Here at the bottom left-hand corner, there's an image of the main conference room where the sessions of treaty bodies, including the Human Rights Committee, take place. Here at the very top of the room, you see very vaguely seats of the Secretariat. Then curiously facing the center, you have the seats reserved for the individual committee members. And then the state either sits at the middle of these desks, and then a couple of representatives usually sit at the end table there with the Secretariat. And then all of the seats that you see here are audience seats. On the side here, you see also the booths of translators. And to sit there is a really curious, another very anthropological moment, because it is a very bewilderingly unpersonalized experience. If you sit there, people their voices are not amplified through mics. So you're unable to listen to who is concretely physically speaking if you're not wearing your headphones. You're unable to see the face of the person, usually because they may be sitting at the same level as you are, facing the center. You won't see their names because, well, you can't see the person who is speaking. You may not actually even hear their own voice, because if they speak in a language that you don't understand, you will most likely be listening to the proceedings in the words of a simultaneous translator. Now, this again is really, really interesting, and I've been thinking of how here there's one moment where the real reality, which is the target of all of these proceedings, it is translated into a UN reality, which is a very particular reality of its own kind. Here's a picture of Lac Le Mans, which is a really beautiful backdrop for these proceedings by the Palais Wilson. Here is the entrance of the Palais Wilson with the statue of Woodrow Wilson there. And here we see also the beautiful corridor. What we also see from these different images, if I go back just very quickly, this actually, and yeah, this here at the top, this is a room where many of the NGO lunchtime briefings take place, which are closed off from state delegations. So what we see also here, there's a number of different places where things are going on at the Palais Wilson. And this is another observation of the question of access, and then also of the question of how to do ethnography. So to summarize my elements of ethnography, and I really did, my bulk of my research is from 2013, but I started to get an active interest in treaty bodies already at the start of the new millennium when I was first working on my PhD. And I was a part of a Nordic school of human rights experts. And there was something very interesting about the way in which the legitimacy quality of treaty bodies was being discussed, which made me curious. So I had a couple of visits in 2005 and 2007 to just get a first glimpse of what was happening. And then since 2013, I have been following up, going back to the Palais Wilson every year or so, and then having communications and so forth and so forth. So what I have been doing with the Human Rights Committee is, of course, having discussions with members of the committee, state delegates, members of the UN Secretariat, NGO delegates, but also, very importantly, a really important insight for doing ethnography at the UN, such people that many, especially those who approach these proceedings from maybe a legal framework or a political science framework, people who might be overlooked. People who worked at the UN conference services, press secretaries, translators, and here I mentioned the lady at the UN cafeteria. And there's a wonderful experience I've had where at one point I realized that at the Cafe Wilson, at the cafeteria of the Palais Wilson, she started to recognize me. And I was very curious of how could that be with all of the masses of people who keep on coming through? How can she recognize me? And of course I could keep myself into thinking that it's my bubbly personality or something, but realistically, the explanation was something different. I started to realize that with all of the numbers of people going through, the number of people who realistically stayed put at the Palais Wilson, who form the fixtures of these proceedings, is surprisingly small. And this was something also where I started to understand the different techniques via which an impression of the international and the universal is also actively created by a certain group of insider actors who are very close to the proceedings. That this isn't something one could elaborate on, but maybe I'll just leave it at that. I had a focus on my report on Finland, or in my research, which is where I'm from. And I have been doing interviews and discussions with civil servants at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and participated in documentary making exercises, and also traveled together on occasion with them to Geneva, and also followed and had discussions with Finnish NGO delegates. And Finland is interesting, where Julie mentioned that Belgium represents kind of the bureaucratic hub of Europe. Finland has a very interesting relationship to the contemporary human rights phenomenon, in that it really echoes Finland's relationship between the East and the West bloc. And one can definitely see a tightening of Finland's participation with the contemporary human rights phenomenon after the end of the Cold War. And therefore studying Finland's story in regards to international human rights is also illustrative of the momentum within the human rights phenomenon more generally. Finland has since the early 1990s also made a particular effort to become something of a model student. And for example, Rosalind Higgins, who is now, or was a former judge of the European Court of Human Rights, before that she was a member of the Human Rights Committee, and she, for example, singled out Finland in her summary and reflection of working with the Human Rights Committee as a state that really performs well. And so looking at Finland's report has offered something of an opportunity to look at treaty body proceedings as they should be. Sometimes it's been called out, I think this is from Clifford Geertz, but someone please correct me if I'm wrong, that ethnography can be called deep hanging out. Well, people really resent this as well, but maybe just for the sake of kind of thinking a little bit of what it's about, this has a point. But also, when doing research at the UN, I think by necessity, one will work with documents a lot. And it is because these are documentary cycles that we're looking at. And as said, for me, there also have been moments of joining in on drafting different documents, and also moments of lobbying. Again, something I would love to talk of more, but I'll move on. So very quickly, what did I do concretely to gain access? Well, I've identified, again, 3 techniques: playing blonde, name dropping, and opportunism. And I won't really elaborate on them too much because they are rather self-explanatory. Rather than to say that all of these moments and techniques were instrumental in order for me to find a way to translate from a nobody into a somebody in this fast-paced UN bureaucracy, where, as also again Julie highlighted, people keep coming and going. So okay, the lady at the cafeteria may recognize me, but that doesn't mean that the human rights members of the members of the Human Rights Committee will. So I had to figure out ways to become someone, to become conspicuous to them, to become someone with whom they would engage, so that I was able to move beyond the surface of just meaningless chit-chat, or it can be meaningful chit-chat, but that will only get you so far. So these are some of the techniques I utilized, and with name dropping, I'm referring to the realization that the field of the Human Rights Committee's operations in certain ways does undisputedly constitute an insider's club. And most people come there through certain connections to certain people who are already there, or they have studied with someone who is known by certain insider actors there, including also interns. So for me, the connection that I could share was a very, very well-known professor of international law, Martti Koskenniemi, and I usually try to find some way of dropping his name into the conversation, and it actually did often work, that people kind of stopped for a moment, and then I started to become someone slowly and slowly. With opportunism, very quickly, that referred to moments of associating myself, again, also with the interns, and following the interns boldly where they went. And I embedded all of that in what I'm calling exaggerated transparency over my research, meaning that I shared what I was doing with key people in the field so that it was commonly known that I was an anthropologist. And I utilized that shared knowledge also as a badge for inclusion, so that I could join in certain sessions. I also did become later an actual intern for one of the committee members, but again, that's something that remained quite informal for reasons that are also interesting. However, of course, the action was not only there. As we saw, number of different rooms within the Palais Wilson, but of course, this action travels back and forth. In the case of Finland, between Finland to Geneva and back. In the case of another state to another state and back. So this action has multiple sides to it. It happens in government offices. It happens in universities, because most of the members, there are 18 members at the Human Rights Committee, most of the members, at least I would say more than half, are professors at universities or human rights institutes. NGOs, their offices are also sites for this action. And of course, then there are the interns of the committee themselves as well. So this raises a question. What UN is it really that we are looking at? So when we're asking, what is it like to do ethnographic or empirical research at the UN? What UN are we really looking at? And I wanted to have here the UN emblem, which is so familiar to us. And even though, of course, the image itself is a bit complicated, there's a simplicity to it, which signals to us instantly that we recognize what it is, and it stands for something which comes to cast in our minds quite almost unconsciously, I would suggest, as something clearly defined and something that is in existence in a sort of an objectively observable way. Now, how can we problematize that by ethnographic research, empirical research? Now, what I want to suggest is that some of the things that I learned, the what, the how, was how often the inside and outside of action is very porous. So this applies also to the notion of gaining access concretely through a badge. So you may get the badge, the observer badge, and you physically can move from the sidewalk inside the conference room of the Palais Wilson. However, that badge will only get you so far. So you can only, with a badge, an observer badge, follow the public sessions, which then only will include the sessions between state representatives and the Human Rights Committee. What about all the other action that is happening? NGO briefings, what about work of the Secretariat? How does one gain access to them? And as I suggested earlier in the techniques that I utilized, through my ethnography, I started to learn how sometimes the borders of these different categories, the border of inclusion and exclusion, can be much more porous. impact often can be opaque. That's also something else I discovered. And this is something that Julie spoke of wonderfully already, so I won't really repeat that. However, I do want to say that this is one of the most important observations, that often, if again we refer back to the idea of legal scholarship or political science with a certain anthropological arrogance, if you permit me, being an anthropologist and being invited to speak of empirical research, maybe I am entitled to that. I think that the kind of analyses that starts with very clear-cut categories and slogans may actually overlook the fact that often what results in things being impactful, having an influence, they are more opaque and they may not be directly evident on the surface. Finally, as also Julie mentioned here, moments when things happen, they are often unexpected, unforeseen. So here, as with the UPR, the focal moment of the ritual might be the constructive dialogue. However, much of that too actually is scripted. There's a document called the List of Issues, which will be adopted months before the actual moment happens. If NGOs have an opportunity to impact that, they will have a much greater opportunity to have the issues that they represent being included in the constructive dialogue. This is just one example of the fact of moments when things happen. They can be unexpected and unforeseen. And to really understand how something ends up in the press release of a constructive dialogue, you need to be there to follow the processes through which things move. These themes move inside the monitoring mechanism. So with all this action that I'm talking of the UN, where does the UN begin and end? Now, this I think is of really great importance because, of course, treaty bodies also operate on a very clear-cut division of different entities. So we have the state, we have the UN, embodied by the members of the Human Rights Committee, even though, as we know, they are not employed by the UN, they're independent experts, but they represent international community. Then you have NGOs, and it's very, very important that all of these entities are separate from one another. There is an inbuilt, not really an adversity, but there's the idea that NGOs will deliver some services or they will engage in some practices that states won't. Whereas in reality, as again, Julie also pointed out, these categories may be much more fluid. And something that I've learned, which is of great interest, is that there in treaty body proceedings, in almost all the scholarship, if one looks at it, which is mostly written from a legal viewpoint. The treaty bodies are a really curious thing that we have scholarship by now by anthropologists on most other monitoring mechanisms and UN bodies, but with treaty bodies, there's still very little out there. There's been the work of Sally Mary and Toby Kelly, and again, please add in the chat if you know more, but it seems that that's about it. And then another work that I have been doing. So with legal scholarship, the assumption is that states come to these proceedings and they try to defend themselves and they try to justify their actions, and NGOs come in and they try to provide evidence that then challenges the narratives of states and show that in fact the information they are sharing is not reliable and that they're not doing the things that they say that they will. In reality, however, I have encountered quite a few examples where state representatives may actually be very much not on the side of their state as such, but rather on the side of human rights concerns. And what they know fully well is that by taking an issue in front of a UN high-profile monitoring mechanism will give the advancement of that particular issue domestically much greater momentum. So they're fully aware of this capacity that these monitoring mechanisms have, and they may not at all be as concerned about only showing a good face of their state in front of the international community. They may rather hope that the UN will pick something up so that they can take that back and take it back to their domestic context and say, look, we have to do something about this so that we can genuinely advance human rights. Even the UN says that. Now, this then again raises questions of, so what should we focus on when we are studying the UN? And I want to here suggest that there are certain unifying features which are really, really important. The people who work under these hats of NGO representative, state representative, even a member of the UN committee or member of the secretariat, they actually have quite a bit of commonalities. They share distinct knowledge practices and, as Annelies Rice has called, legal technicalities. Now, approaching this work from this inside-out viewpoint offers us to grasp what they are all about in an entirely different way. It gives us a much more nuanced analytical understanding of what is really going on than if we go and we start to study things sort of from the top, from these formal categories of state, NGO, and the UN. And here, we need ethnography to understand all this analytically. And I wanted to share here, I'm very fond of this metaphor of ice. We also heard that it's something that Julie and Jane have used. And I really like, well, I'm from Finland. We have a lot to do with ice, evidently. So all of the different shapes and incarnations of ice are quite familiar. So I wanted to bring here also this picture of ice, where what ethnography actually can do is to make this emblem of the UN, which was so neat and clearly organized. You had the blue and the white and the image, and it was fixed. You can start to see it in a much fuzzier way. And we can grasp some of the fuzzy logic that really applies to how the UN functions. Now, fuzzy logic I borrowed from Bourdieu, who describes it as an indeterminacy of rules, the creative gap between habitus and institutional structure. And I really think that there's a lot more work here to be done, also for understanding how, under the guise of opacity, insider actors are able to maneuver so that they can take issues that they consider to be of importance further. In another context, I've described this as the process of looping, how you can loop things around under the guise of opacity. And of course, all this is directly in contrast with the idea of the UN functioning through transparency, which we can also say is one of the key slogans of today, and it is a legitimating factor for the operations of the UN that its proceedings are seen as being transparent. So there may be some uncomfort also with the idea that in fact there's a lot to be gained from not making things too transparent. And just very quickly before I conclude, an example from one of these processes where there was an attempt to streamline or strengthen the functioning of treaty bodies. It's quite a messy system with the 10 treaty bodies, and there's some overlap, and then there's a problem of, on the one hand, over-reporting, and then there's a problem of under-reporting, where only under 1/5 of all the states fulfill their reporting obligations. So curiously, the system can only function because it's failing. If all the states started to submit all their reports, the system would collapse. There's not even nearly enough resources within the UN to handle that. So in one of these proceedings to streamline or strengthen this procedure, the question came up, I was one part of this one procedure, the question came up on whether it would be advantageous to try and clarify something, to make things appear more sort of organized, more robust, to clarify how things work. And someone from inside the UN pointed out that in fact, that may be very ill-advised. Because what now happens is that the Human Rights Committee, like the other committees, they have been founded on the basis of particular covenant provisions. And these covenant provisions are very open. They leave it up to the committees themselves to decide how they organize their work. And consequently, the committees have been able to be quite progressive in interpreting this mandate broadly. For example, the Human Rights Committee has introduced these lunchtime briefings with NGOs, and there are other different initiatives as well. So this high-profile person within the UN pointed out, if something like this was even attempted to be formalized, it would then give states who do not like, some of them don't like these rogue committees who are interpreting their mandates very extensively, akin to something of a normative force. It might then give states an opportunity to attack something. So in the interest of taking the mission of these committees further to advance human rights, it would be more advantageous to do it under the guise of opacity. Now I will conclude my talk here. I have a feeling that I also took quite a bit of time. It's difficult when it's something that you are quite passionate about, but I really look forward to discussion, and I want to thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Miia, for this wonderful presentation and sharing the how to do research at the UN, what is the UN at the end, was really extremely interesting, and I learned a lot also from Julie's presentation, and certainly indeed, well, as an anthropologist, I also need sometimes to stress why anthropology is so important in social science, and indeed it's to look to the unforeseen and the unexpected. Sometimes we think that's only being seen if you go to remote communities somewhere at the other part of the world, but even within the UN, those are the spaces that we as anthropologists can added value, to use one of those words. So I now give the floor to Camille Parigual and Marina Beira. They are two PhD researchers within the Rivers project. So one of the two research streams within the project, which is a very complex project, is exactly about the UN, and comes a bit from my own experience in those years as in Ecuador, and seeing how that monster of the UN is actually working, and all the challenges around it. And I had more the opportunity to be closer to the mandate holder of the Special Rapporteur of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, as one of the other special procedures. So there in this research stream, what we hope to unveil and to uncover and to see with our eyes, hopefully at some point in a physical way, is how within the UN is water and land and life is being conceptualized, and to what extent indigenous knowledge, and what kind of indigenous knowledge, and who defines the knowledge, is really getting into those documents now. So there are two different research packages, and Camille, she just started in the beginning of this year, working in the work package C, which is focused on human rights treaty bodies and the whole knowledge production process about water, the human rights to water, but now also the human rights to a healthy environment is really getting entangled, and we see a lot of concepts coming up: the rights of nature, the environment, the ecosystem, water. But yeah, how do legal experts think and actually act about those concepts that are taking shape these days? Camille has a master's degree in political science at the University of Lausanne, with a focus on globalization issues. And Marina Beira has a master's degree in ecology and has worked more than 10 years with the traditional indigenous peoples in the Brazilian Amazon, and she is working within the other work package in that same research stream about indigenous knowledge brokers at the international level. So I'm happy to give the floor to Camille and Marina, who have been reading your work, of Julie, Miia, also Maria, etc. And they want to give some comments and also some additional questions, because they are starting with a PhD project. And yeah, it was wonderful to hear from you both your own experiences and to share those experiences with us who still are starting in this process. So I think Camille will start, if I'm right, or it's Marina.
Yeah, thanks, Lisette. Hello, everybody, and thank you very much, Julie and Miia, for your really interesting presentations. As we were preparing the seminar, we were thinking about the importance of conducting legal anthropology at the United Nations. So Miia, you have done extensive research on the UN human rights system, including work on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Human Rights Committee, the Office of the Human Rights, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, for example. And Julie, you have conducted this ethnography of the Universal Periodic Review. And so we wanted to ask, why is it important to study the institutions of the United Nations through the lens of ethnographic research? And related to this, we were also wondering about the particularities of doing institutional ethnography. So Julie, you have also carried out ethnographic research in other contexts, for example, among women targeted by humanitarian projects in Afghanistan, for example, or you have also worked on Islam in England and with fieldwork in Sharia councils and law firms specialized in Islamic law. And more recently, you have also worked on the practices of delegates from the International Committee of the Red Cross. And Miia, you have also worked, for example, on family reunification in Finland. So these are really different contexts, and taking this into account, what is special about institutional ethnography and more especially at the United Nations? So you have, both of you have mentioned the importance of documentary practices, but we would be happy to hear you comment a bit more on this. So I don't know who would like to begin.
Should I, Miia, or do you want to start?
Please, I can rest my voice. I spoke for so long. So.
Right, okay. Okay, so I start. Perhaps the first thing I can say is that, you know, it's actually surprisingly difficult to do research at the United Nations. I mean, often people tell me, well, it must have been a relief to move away from Afghanistan and start studying the UN. And actually, well, yes and no, right? I mean, the research in Afghanistan in the context of post-war reconstruction, which was neither reconstruction nor post-war, was really war and chaos, was difficult in itself. But I felt this immediate sense of surprise, yeah, because it was a country I didn't know as much, a language I didn't master completely. So I could rely on my sense of surprise. At the UN, I had to make the familiar strange, even though there were many things that were really strange, of course, yeah. I mean, the UN language is very opaque and complicated to understand, so I had to learn that language. But I felt that the people I met were very much like me, yeah. They could have, you know, we could have studied together. We were the same in a way. So I think it's complicated for that reason, because there is not this immediate automatic sense of exoticism and surprise. Also because people move constantly, yeah. So you can't really build long-term relationships. It's very hard. So you have to catch people wherever they are, in corridors, you know, in cafeterias. Perhaps if you're lucky, you will be able to see 2 or 3 times and then they will disappear. Yeah. And Jane managed to develop some kind of relationship with, you know, a UN diplomat from Nepal because her husband worked at the UN. So she had managed to kind of develop this relation through, you know, through the work of her husband. But in general, we didn't develop long-term relationships. So that was kind of disruptive in a way, because we always want to no more, you know, be able to, you know, go beyond the surface. And that required different kinds of strategies. But the reason why I think it's important to do legal anthropology at the United Nations, to answer your question, is because in spite of its claim to transparency, it's a very opaque machine. It's claiming to be transparent, but it's so not. So I think it's our work it's a work of anthropologists to open this black box and also to show the public, look, this is how it works. This is what you can perhaps do with it. Yeah. So I think it's taking their claim to transparency very seriously and opening the black box to make the UN more democratic, more participatory. Yeah? Because all these words are words that the UN are using themselves. So I'd say, you know, that anthropologists have a big role to play in looking at the details of how it works, to make it make it more accessible, more transparent, and also more understandable. I mean, many people say, what is this thing, the UN? What are they doing, these people? They are bureaucrats. Well, actually, I just feel like it's an argument, the anti-bureaucracy argument that is often used to legitimize cuts in public expenditures. And it's an easy argument. And I also find that, I'm not pro-UN, I'm just trying to, but I also think that these administrations are really devoted in general, even though we would like them to be able to do more. But we need to show, I mean, what is the price to pay for these commitments? And the price is to be able to, to master the art of technicalities, of modalities, and that needs to be also understood by the public more generally. So perhaps I stop here and I let Miia intervene now.
Thank you very much for the question and also for this reflection, Julie. I think maybe I'll start here. What was strange for me is that when I finally really started my fieldwork at the Human Rights Committee, everything sort of fell into place in my research. And I had a distinct sense of like really being a fish in water, which is not a feeling that we often get in many field site contexts, but it was a weird thing for me. Somehow everything that I had done up until that moment, it just somehow worked. And I had an ease, I could write so much, and I had an ease about the whole thing. And I think I have to share a little bit about my background, because my background is very different from Julie's and most other anthropologists, in that I don't have that kind of an initiation rite of passage in doing an ethnography in a traditional anthropological site. For me, I've always struggled with that epistemological relationship to studying people who are fundamentally different from me. I've always somehow struggled with the legitimacy of that intellectual project. And for me, I've always been drawn to studying people who are very similar to me. And I know that, this is a minority view in anthropology. We have these discussions, but you really need that right of initiation to qualify. And that's also the reason why I feel like over the past years, I've been a bit quiet of my background, because I really, I have a dual background. I'm also trained in law. I did an LLM back in the days, and when I was working on my PhD, the high-profile international lawyer I mentioned, I was working at that research institute. And it's taken me a long time to internalize a really solid anthropological identity in the absence of this studying of the other. So, but for me, I've also somehow been really weirdly, sort of really geekily just obsessed with studying human rights. There's something about them, just as Julie says, that not necessarily a fan or for the UN. I'm actually not for human rights either. And I mean it when I say that I have no idea whether the world is a better place today, because for the last 70 years, we have been talking of things increasingly, we have been talking of first a small group of people within the UN, and then gradually a bigger community around the world has been speaking of things called human rights. I don't know if we would have a better world if all this talk was devoted toward the human dignity or human duties, or I used this example in my class the other day. If all the money and all the organization had been devoted around yoga as a way of creating inner peace and create, respect for your body and everyone else's, I don't know, and nobody does, because we cannot have a parallel comparative universe. But I am fascinated. So I lack that conviction that through talk and action around human rights, the world is becoming a better place. But I am fascinated, like a bee to a pot of honey, by the devotion that I see in so many of my interlocutors. And this, for me, is the thing that I need to understand anthropologically. It's almost like they have a lollipop and I don't, and I want to understand why they have it, this belief in something that the world is becoming a better place. I think, just to add one final thing about what makes this research, sorry, someone is trying to enter my workspace here, but I will block them out if you heard a doorbell in the background. What is particular about it is that when you're doing institutional ethnography, you have to always remember that doing direct observations of people will only take you so far. Greg Feldman has a paper that I'm very fond of, which talks about how to do fieldwork within global apparatuses. And there he distinguishes between personal relations and connections, or it's the other way around, I always forget, either personal connections and relations, where one set of these relations are mediated through a relationship to the global apparatus. So you cannot reduce such global phenomena as UN human rights monitoring mechanisms to sole empirical observations. And this, I think, is a theoretical shift that we have to make. We have to somehow come to terms with the fact that our empirical observations have their limitations. We're always dealing with an imagined or a real relationship to however we define the global apparatus. And I'm actually working on something that has to do with the anthropology of gaps and absences, which is something that really annoys the field worker when you realize that you should follow this document here or look at that NGO there, and you feel like, okay, I'm not getting the full picture. I think here the most important insight is no one is getting the full picture. No one is getting full access, and somehow they deal with it. And then when you start to see that the analysis of the worth is in the gaps, realizing how people who join in on these procedures and mechanisms fill in the gaps, what is the glue that is in the gaps, then you're starting to see it again anthropologically and analytically, and that's when things start to get even more exciting.
Well, thank you very much. I don't know if Well, Miia and Julie, I want to thank you very much for your very inspiring presentations and sharing all the great work you have done so far, and also for the comments. I have two quick comments. I think that only lead us to more and more discussion in such an interesting debate. And my first comment regards to the informal spaces, the importance of the informal spaces that both of you have highlighted so much. That these off-stage dynamics, as Julie points out, how they are so important for us to better understand the processes of norm production and feeling all the tensions, and also understanding all the negotiation processes that happens beyond the formal arenas. So my question is specifically about this moment that we are facing worldwide with the pandemic and all the restrictions we had to deal with to actually being present in our fieldwork. So I want to hear, to listen to your thoughts. Are there specific challenges, or what are the specific challenges and constraints in the present age of digital ethnography, and how to deal with it? And my second comment regards the public and participative nature of these environments. Both of you also have mentioned how the interactive or the constructive dialogues are not very much interactive nor constructive, and how important it is to understand where this interaction and where these dialogues are being constructed. And there are different methods to assess these practices at the UN, at the UN human rights system. And these methods may involve a more participative approach, as being an intern, as Julie said, as Julie did, and other methods like the exaggerated transparency, as Miia shared with us. And so I want to listen from you. If you consider that you conducted participatory and or action research at somehow. I know that I read Julie's paper on the true keepers, and she described there as she engaged in making one of the documents speak for the final report of the UPR. So do you, Julie,
consider that in that moment you were doing like an action research or something like that. So I wanted to listen from both of you, as it is River's approach. To what extent do you think it's possible to conduct action and or participatory research at the UN? So I will be grateful to hear you. Which one wants to start?
Maybe I continue, and so that Miia can have a little break.
Great.
Yeah, so that's true that the current moment requires that you find alternative strategies to observing, doing research. It's a big moment when, everyone is talking about digital ethnography, and everyone is experimenting with that, format, or trying to kind of explore what that could look like. Observing meetings online instead of, in the room where they take place is a really different thing. I think it's not the same feel at all. It brings another layer of perhaps opacity. At the same time, I did this exercise this year with my students. So I made them watch the Universal Periodic Review of the United States online. It was an interesting moment. Biden had just been elected, so the delegation was still a Trump kind of delegation, but on the go. They were about to leave. And that was interesting because many of the statements made by recommending states were pre-recorded. So they were not actually live. Yes, they were played live, but they had been recorded before. So there was, some staging going on, even more. So some state representatives would pause with, their flag, or they would have, a translation in English, or of what they were saying. They would have, a painting behind them, some of them, or some would be very relaxed. Actually, the Nordic countries were the funniest, Miia. I don't know if you watched this. There was I don't know, I think a Norwegian representative who was basically in her kitchen with her bike at the at the back. So it was also for some of them quite, they were taking this moment as an exceptional moment where they were, not really thinking about staging, but were rather presenting themselves as they were in their own environment. So there are additional things that you could look at by watching the reviews online, which are equally significant. And there were non-verbal messages that were passed. For instance, the delegate of the representative of Iran had a portrait next to him of an Iranian citizen who was kept in prison in the US, I think. So, there were other signs to be read that you could not see, you could not have seen if the meeting had taken place in the normal setup. So that are interesting observations. Now, I guess, now that we've been online for a bit more than a year, I think people have developed also some kind of sociality online. Many of the UN meetings are taking place online, and I wonder, and that's something you should test, whether this has increased the possibilities for intervening, for making comments, for, whether the system has closed itself off, or on the contrary, whether it has enabled greater participation. What I find interesting, is that since the beginning of the pandemic, many of the, academic conferences are happening online, and I feel that we are becoming increasingly relaxed about that. And also we are able to, to talk to people we would not have had a chance to meet otherwise, because they are too far away, and traveling is too costly and time consuming. So I don't know, you have to explore that. When it comes to participatory research, that's interesting that you see my position as an intern as a form of participatory research. Well, for me, I was doing participant observation. I was not really thinking that I was doing some kind of activist research and so on, but that's true that I got caught in that game at some point. At the beginning, when I first interned, my first days as an intern, I really had a very strong experience of feeling of boredom. I thought, okay, this is too boring, you know, I can't do that job. I had to classify, you know, the NGOs who had sent their submissions according to their ECOSOC status and search on databases, you know, whether or not they had this status, and it was extremely tedious, very annoying. And I thought, okay, you know, I don't see what I'm doing. It's pure, very stupid bureaucracy. But then when I started attending the meetings with the other drafters, and I started to see the strategies they developed to, you know, make these documents highlight the issue that for them were very important, deciding together what were the priorities and so on. And I thought, okay, so we're doing actually something, you know, in between the lines. And this made my work much more interesting suddenly. So yes, I also, like them, thought, okay, this is an important issue. It came up in 3 reports. I think it should be, you know, in that paragraph, it would make sense because the state is not too sensitive to that issue. It could accept such a recommendation if we frame it this way. So yes, perhaps without even being aware of it, I became a kind of, engaged anthropologist in that sense. Now with Miia, we also participated together in a research, a consultancy at the UN 1 year ago. And what was interesting there is that it was a research that had been commissioned by the Office of the High Commissioner itself. And there, actually, we were asked to do, an ethnography and to study diversity at the UN ethnographically. So it was me and Miia and Agathe Mora. And what was interesting there is that we had with us people who were committed to this research, more or less, even though they were quite busy. So we could establish this kind of steering committee, of people from different department units who were kind of research collaborators, who were also some kind of, people who helped us, open the doors of some offices, navigate the different units, and also people we could use as a sounding board to start analyzing our data. And that was, more participatory in the sense that we could really work more closely with this group and co-produce knowledge together. And perhaps there is room within your own project to imagine such a collaboration. It depends, I guess, from your ability to negotiate something with a special rapporteur or with the expert mechanism, for instance. But Miia will have probably more ideas.
Yeah, thanks. I'll continue on that. I think the idea of participatory research, I think as anthropologists, it's weird that we may be the ones who reflect on this the most. We may be the ones who potentially see the most, the thing that, oh my gosh, could there be something wrong ethically, and could it compromise my position in terms of producing knowledge? If you think about international lawyers, they do this all the time. I mean, one of the things that makes human rights scholarship so tricky, and I'm trying to find a way to articulate that, is we are looking at decades of something where the actors have been the analysts. And they are the ones who move between these positions. And there's a great term, again, from work of Annelies Riles, who takes it from Marilyn Stradone, of course, of extracting knowledge. And you can only extract knowledge if you are considered to be sufficiently of an outsider. And international lawyers, they have what I've myself described as positions of creative agency. They have a societally accepted structural position of authority in which they can act with a certain creative space, and they can push understandings of what, for example, the ICCPR says with a certain credibility and legitimacy to them. And they're not really, worried about this. They only operate on the basis of what they believe is right. So they can be a member of the Human Rights Committee representing the committee, then they can be an academic writing an academic analysis on that, and then they can be a government consultative, again, offering advice on how it's done, and even an NGO representative. So they have no scruples about that. And for myself too, I actually ended up having rather unexpected moments of being an activist. I say that I don't know if the world is a better place because of human rights. It doesn't mean that I don't recognize instances where we need to engage with something. And there happened to be a time where there was supposed to be a representatives for LGBTI plus issues. The abbreviation keeps on changing a bit within the UN. And there was an NGO, an umbrella NGO based in Geneva who was supposed to appear at their lunchtime briefing, but for some reason the person never came. And the committee members really wanted information on that. And ironically, I had interviewed the head of the Finnish NGO for LGBTI rights just before that. And actually that's because she said that this discussion inspired them to submit an ancillary report. So I actually was quite involved. So I said, after the hearing, when they really were trying the committee members to ask, well, does anyone know about LGBTI rights? Then I, at the end, quite timidly just raised my hand and said, well, I actually do know quite a bit. And I could try to get in touch with the head of the organization in Finland and see if they could maybe submit some additional information, which I did. And I ended up then being a knowledge broker of trying to guide the head of the NGO in, again, offering 3 points, because that's what you can do. She started out with an intervention that had all about revising entire Finnish legislation. And I'm kind of like, that's not going to fly. So 3 points. So I ended up being very much a knowledge broker, which then made me keenly invested in the proceedings, of really feeling nervous when the constructive dialogue went on. Is this going to come up? Is it going to be picked up? So you have these moments. And I would say that one role that would be of use could be to seek contacts with NGOs who do not have the resources to make appearances in Geneva, either for the constructive dialogue or for the adoption of lists of issues. And if one is able to negotiate this role carefully, it might be something that is welcomed also by the representatives of the Office of the High Commissioner, because I found that people were a bit almost more suspicious of, why am I just hanging out there? Why am I not trying to do something? So it might even be a more acceptable way to legitimize the kind of research one is doing rather than compromising its integrity. And finally, to conclude really quickly, because I know we're out of time, this idea of doing online research, again, we have to remember, as Julie also mentioned, it's not just for the ethnographer that this is weird. This is happening for everyone. And we don't know. I'm really curious to follow, are treaty body proceedings going to come back exactly to the model that they had? There's been so much talk of cutting funding for travel of external experts. It's really expensive. Are we going to see a return? Or is this the end of something and the start of something new? And this experience, of course, is equally relevant for everyone. And I agree. It's weirdly, Finland actually submitted its next report. It was one of the 2 states just a month ago selected for a pilot to do it online. And this is another reason why I need to get my book done, because now the formal documentary cycle is really over. And it was strange to watch it because it was both more detached and unpersonal and more intimate and local. Because you could see things like people were very informally dressed, quite informally, actually. I was very surprised. And you could see things like, kitchen cabinets and maybe bicycles. And you could see a sense of the world simultaneously being present there in the UN with the emblem, and then being sort of brought to the homes of people who all of a sudden became real individuals. So there's really something interesting happening. There's all this talk about the digital divide and, human right to internet, which is an interesting discussion too, because of course it's not all equally divided. So some people will have better internet connection and they can join such webinars, others can't. So what happens there? But nevertheless, this is something to follow with keen interest. However, I will admit that it might be a bit easier if you've already had the opportunity to be there present also in person. But nevertheless, lots of ethnographic insights there. And then it could be followed up with interviews and whatnot.
Thank you so much, Miia and Julie. There was one of a question of the public that, although it's already 5 o'clock here in Madrid, but we started a bit later. So in the chat, there was Belle, who had a question that she is actually, she is a PhD researcher, and she is studying the UN decision-making in relation to gender production and transitional justice. And she is curious that if it is not possible to be an intern, because you both mentioned that you have been, or that you were an intern at the UN, at the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. So if it is not possible to be an intern, how do you gain access into relevant spaces? For example, she will do ethnography at the offices or at the agencies of UN Women and the UNDP. So do you have any insights or recommendations in case being an intern is not an option for researchers? Miia or Julie, I don't know who would like or who has some recommendations.
Yeah, well, perhaps I was about to say, you were perhaps not interning as much, Miia, but you found other entry points which were equally, I think, useful and which worked quite well. And I think, using Miia's techniques could be one way of doing it. That is to say, just simply getting in touch with people, explaining that very transparently and very bluntly that you are interested and that you want to talk to people. And when people will direct you to another, and then you will be perhaps able to attend the meetings too, or be involved in some proceedings, offer your service. What you perhaps need to identify is what you can offer, and I think that's a good way of studying the UN. Is what can you offer that is of value for this mechanism that you want to look at as a gift. As anthropologists, we offer gifts to our informants. So when I worked in Afghanistan, it was easy to find gifts. The girls with whom I boarded in that dormitory, they loved ice cream. I offered a lot of ice creams. Other women, they love jewelry, they love perfumes, things like that, that were not easily available. And I offered that in return for the time they spent with me. Or I would invite them to, to drink tea and things like that. But at the UN, there are other kinds of gifts you can give. And I think it's your gift of knowledge.
I think that's a great piece of advice. And I really think that to just hang out somewhere, like Julie is right in saying that I've done, that's kind of really weird. And that's kind of like off the norm. So really to find a way to make yourself necessary, indispensable in the proceedings, that usually is a way to recognize the time that people invest in them. And indeed, I have never been formally an intern of the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. I was an informal intern of one of the committee members of the Human Rights Committee, which is again another way of saying so what is the UN and what is not the UN? And what that might mean in terms of trying to start with research is one could see one of the organizations that is involved in some of this work that has its heart or its center in Geneva. One could try to start with some of these documentary processes. One could try to find different entry points and from that work your way through slowly and slowly. For me, it was only the third session, the end of the second session when I was literally just hanging out, when I managed to have enough of a contact to seize the opportunity to ask someone, well, could I be your intern the next time? And then also, the idea of being useful that's a really good piece of advice. I did try to make myself useful. Sometimes you may think that you're more useful than you are, but that idea, I think, is the one to have. One concrete piece of advice that I would have is don't ask a question to which you do not want to have no for an answer, because that will close a door that may not be closed before that no is being said. So time your questions well, know your field and your interlocutors to know what kind of questions are appropriate. And that is also a really important way of doing field work. So don't think, this Julie has heard me say before, the insights are not out there, they're here. So don't think that only once you gain access, this is what I've been trying to say, once you gain access to the UN, will the ethnography start. The ethnography is all over you. the moment when you find that border of inclusion and exclusion, you have learned something. The moment you find a way around that border, you have learned something. So make sure to tune in your ethnographic sensibilities now, and then start to work yourself gradually. There are no shortcuts. Even if you had that internship, you might not really get that much. So you might get more by sitting at home and trying to figure out, like Julie's students did, and my students are going to do as well, how to get access to one of these sessions. You might learn more of that than you would to actually be there.
Thank you, Julie and Miia. And there was one final question that one of the participants asked in the chat of Zoom. And it's a question to Miia. It's from Stella Terjung, if I pronounce well her family name. And her question is, how much of a role did privilege play in the playing blonde strategy? Was it an advantage for the research that you were studying people that are similar to you? Could anyone have done this research?
Thank you very much. And hi, Stella. She's a student of mine, so I'm very glad.
Okay. Yeah, Stella. I'm sorry.
Yeah, it's a brilliant question. Stella's a brilliant student. So, no, I think this is a really, really good question. And indeed, this we've discussed in class. As anthropologists, we're very fond of thinking that we can offer the alternative viewpoint. We can offer the voice of the subaltern and whatnot. Realistically, anyone who is doing fieldwork and research at the UN is part of the elite. And there's no kidding, going around that. That's a fact. And therefore, being part of the elite can mean a number of different things. I mean, you can be a part of a certain financial elite. With the UN, you need to have one part of that. So you need to have research institutes that will back up your research, because this is expensive stuff to do. And in addition, being a part of the UN elite means being part of a certain knowledge community, having a fluency in some certain kind of language, having something that creates enough of a similarity so that one is able to then sort of become one part of the community. And I would say that here, the fact that my background, which I've in anthropological circles tried to hide a lot, the fact that I was so comfortable working with lawyers had a lot to do with the ease with which that I was able to do my research, because I knew the people. I had been studying with them. They were my academic bosses. They would evaluate my research proposals. They would hire me or not hire me. So I mean, I was all enmeshed in that community, even though I was always the weird anthropologist. But I mean, yeah, what can you do? But I would say that absolutely a certain kind of privilege of having a certain shared knowledge, a certain shared sense of community and expert practices. But in that way, I would argue that it had nothing to do with my nationality or, the kind of white privilege. Anyone from any part of the world, and I think this is another important insight, talking of cultural difference is often misleading, because anyone who joins in on these procedures will be a part of this knowledge practice elite. No matter whether they have an indigenous background or not, they need to have this shared elite background. And this, of course, is a really interesting challenge for you guys at Rivers, because when you're looking at the indigenous experts and expertise, how is that translated into this very elite knowledge practice world of the UN?
Thank you so much, Miia, also for bringing the ball back to the Rivers Project and our many challenges that we are facing. And that's indeed one of the things that we hope to explore in the next years. And yeah, I think that this brilliant seminar has come to an end. It has been very intense, 2 hours, despite that we already more or less a year accustomed to this kind of online seminars. We all know it's quite exhausting. So yeah, I would really express my gratitude to Julie and to Miia for sharing their extraordinary experiences within the UN. It was extremely insightful. I learned a lot, and I'm pretty sure that everyone who joined the seminar learned a lot. I've seen that there are a lot of young researchers getting to start with their research and concerned about how to do or how to get access to this kind of huge institutions. So thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and your experiences. I would also like to thank Marine and Camille for setting up the seminar, for organizing the seminar, and for sure we're going to have a follow-up seminar at some point, hopefully in person, which is always much nicer. And also thank you everyone who has been joining us from different parts. I guess the majority probably from Europe, but maybe also from other parts. And please stay tuned in with the Rivers project about what we are doing, and for sure in the next years we're gonna give a continuation on this kind of seminars about how to do empirical research, but also starting to share at some point also the research results now. You're all very welcome to follow I need to self-promote also a little bit the project, so you can follow everything what we're doing on our website, on our Twitter account. This seminar is recorded, such as all the other seminars that we have done so far. You can find this on the YouTube channel. Did I mention that we have Facebook too? I think so, or not. But thank you very much. And thank you again, Julie and Miia, for these extraordinary presentations. And thank you so much for everyone. And see you online on the next Rivers seminar.
Thank you very much on my part as well. It's been a great pleasure.
Thank you so much. It was delightful.